Well, this week I spoke to James Daniel, the IMF's mission chief to China, and I began by asking him how he thinks China views its role in this interconnected world.
Well, looking at it from a Chinese perspective, I think China will want to put its own mark on globalization, but it will definitely want to support it. I mean, globalization has worked really well for China, and it wants it to keep thriving. So I think they'll want to have a larger role, which they're already doing in the IMF. The IMF has got more and more Chinese people, more and more management level Chinese representation, and they're having a very active role within the IMF. I think also, though, the Chinese will want to make globalization sustainable, and that, I think they know, also means talking about some of the negative spillovers from their policies on overcapacity or SOEs. So I think they realize there's work to be done at home as well.
And we've certainly seen some movement in that direction with reforms, sometimes not at the pace that trade partners would like to see. Now, as China's mission chief, obviously you oversee the relations between the IMF and China, and you also forecast what's going to be happening with the Chinese economy. Now, it is predicted to slow down in 2019. What are the main factors that are going to be driving that?
Well, there's two factors. There's the external environment, and there's what's happening in China itself. Externally, of course, as you know, the IMF is forecasting the global economy to slow in 2019, and global trade will also be slower. Plus, there's, as everyone knows, the US trade conflict, which will have a particular bearing on Chinese growth. But also domestically, there's a lot going on domestically in China. One of the things that the Chinese have done over the last 18 months or so, which has been actually quite positive, is to reduce the amount of risk in the financial sector. But the implication of this is that there's less credit available, especially for the private sector, and that's weighing on growth somewhat. So putting those factors together, we see a bit of a slowdown in 2019 in China.
We've certainly seen the US-China trade war dominating a lot of the headlines. They do seem to be inching closer to something of a deal. And we have seen China continue to make some concessions. How do you think addressing some of these structural issues will not just benefit China's trade partners, but China itself?
Absolutely. I mean, China, the story of China in the last 40 years is how China's integration into the world economy has been good for China. It's lifted 800 million people out of poverty and made it the second largest economy in the world. So greater integration of China into the global economy is a good thing for China. And I think if what we read is correct about some of the structural issues that are being discussed now between the US and China, and if there's concrete action, these are things that are in China's own interest. And indeed, to give China credit, they're already pursuing many of them. For example, on intellectual property protection, China's already making quite a lot of effort there already. So I think a lot of what is being asked about for China is already in China's best interests, and that should be something that they should embrace. But obviously, I'm not party to the talk, so it's partly speculation on my behalf.
Now, we know that obviously the US-China trade war is one of the things that is weighing on some of the predictions for the global economic slowdown. But in terms of the sectors that are expected to do well in spite of that, what do you see?
Well, Rachelle, the way we see the Chinese economy is in a broad kind of macro perspective. And what we see is that China's becoming a more mature economy, and it's also becoming a bit more sustainable and, as we say as an economist, rebalanced. So what does that mean? That means consumption is going to do better than investment. So all the consumption-facing sectors should, on the whole, be performing better. Equally, we think services, which are quite underdeveloped in China, will be doing better, whereas the industrial sector will grow relatively less, especially the low-tech industrial sector. As China moves up the value-added chain, it's going to be moving more into the high-tech sectors. So those are the sectors that we think will be doing better, the high-tech industry and the more consumer-facing sectors.
Now, it's interesting because a lot of the high-tech sectors are where we've seen a lot more friction as China does upgrade its economy. We've seen some trade partners showing some skepticism. How do you think China can balance really trying to upgrade and enter the high-tech market when it does meet some skepticism from some trade partners?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think China has a right to develop and is naturally going to develop and is going to move up the value-added chain and will be a competitor in these sectors. But we just have to make sure that China plays by the global rules so that it's not a big cost for the rest of the world. And I think China is more and more aware that it's got a lot to gain from protecting the global trading system as it is. So we'd hope that both China and its partners can find a new kind of understanding.
And as countries do tend to they do seem to be sort of shifting around and finding their place in the world now. What should we be keeping an eye on in terms of China's place on the global stage?
Look, China has had a limited role in the global stage for many years. Probably not as much as its economy would warrant. Now its economy is really on its way to becoming perhaps even the largest economy. It's already the largest exporter in the world. It's also producing more and more investment goods for the rest of the world and investing in other countries. So I think we're going to see a much larger role for China. Now, China is going to shape it in its own image to a certain extent, to its own interests, which is only natural. But we also have to expect that the world has to adjust to China's new strength. But China also needs to do some of its own homework. Take the Belt and Road Initiative, for example. Now, we in international institutions have been saying there's a huge infrastructure gap in many countries. And China is now able and willing to provide the finance to fill those gaps and the expertise. So the question is, how can we make that work best for everybody? For example, addressing some of the risks, welcoming the benefits, but addressing the risks, like making sure the loans are sustainable, making sure they're transparent, making sure there's a competitive bidding process. So I think we can work with China to make it work for the global economy.